now we will dig into the business models with Stefan here, who will introduce his thesis to us. So please, welcome.
Thank you. So I thought we can rise again. Rise? All rise. Ah. So because I want to continue on Mr. Lycken's experiment. I want to make an empirical observation. So please, everybody, sit who have heard about ERS and know what it is. Don? No. So this is the first time this happens to me. I always used to ask this question. Who knows about ERS? And this is the first time this happened. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm presenting this book, my thesis. Represents about 8 years of my life. And during this time, it's been really fantastic. And I mean, you've heard some of these people talking here. And really visionaries and brave people and bold people. And it's been really fun to do research here. But if I want to ask you some other question, then it would be, so what is ERS an example of? What could we learn from ERS regarding to business models? And maybe most importantly, what you're thinking about, what's the future for ERS? And then we can answer other questions like, why ERS? And I've not heard so many people talk about energy security as a driving force, as this is really important to some nations. We tend to think about the Paris Agreement, about climate change, and we see that this is actually quite agreement, it's a global agreement. So it's not something that just we think about, regardless if the US withdraws. And there's also, I think this is one of the main driving forces that will be behind ERS is regarding air quality. And this left picture is then from the south coast of district in LA, where you have the projected level for NOx, this is in ton NOx then, is up there over 300 tons. This is with all the improvements that they can see that they can take. Then they end up at that level. However, they have to meet the federal restriction. They have to come to these levels by 2023 and 2032. So, and they don't know how to go about it. And heavy trucks is most important here. And as we heard yesterday, the curve is going up. So transportation is really something that we want and need, and it's flexible and it's relatively low cost. So just to sum up, that there are different technologies or improvements that can be made. And if you see the green one here, those are the ones that have then the potential, the highest impact on both energy security, climate change, and air pollution. So we really need a sustainable transition, right? How to go about it. And there's also one, I've stolen this from Trafikverket. I like to show this because this is something which is, Jan mentioned now, that there is also economic incentive here that we can save cost for the operators, which can then make a possibility to invest in both vehicles and infrastructure. Okay, so ERS. When I started, this is a picture from me and my supervisor Mats Engvall when we were drunk, or not drunk, but we were waiting in the airport and trying to figure out what is this all about. And this is a typical transportation system for us. So we have a vehicle, we have road, and we have a petrol station. There's three subsystems that are well standardized. We know the interfaces. It's been there for over 100 years. And then we think about electrifying or going for change. And then we tend to believe, or we believed, that we should stand still and charge the vehicle, just replace this fueling station with a charging station. And that worked for passenger vehicles, and then when you thought about trucks, it became more problematic because the batteries are not so good, all this you know. So we come up with this electric road system that's really very fascinating for a researcher as me, that you can study a case where the system interfaces are changed and where you have new types of actors coming in, which will then also require new types of business models. So how do transition happen? And innovation scholars like S-curves. So this is just to simplify that you have we are maybe here in pre-development, before it then takes off, accelerate, and then stabilized, some sort of use of extent then, over time. But there is more problems to that. So first, then the question is ERS a transition in the making? Where we can see that we have different types of projects, like pilot project, demonstration project, and deployment projects, that will then enter niche and mass markets. And I will comment a little bit more what these mean. But you can also do S-curves the other way. You can do it down and up. And I think this was what Jan was into it, the value of death, that you hope that, okay, we put in a lot of resources here, and then it will have some market penetration. But there is a gap here. Many technologies fail to actually become successful. So how can ERS bridge the value of death? How can it become commercial? Is then business model the solution? And what's a business model? It's in literature we talk about usually that the business model is about value proposition, value creation, and value capture. Okay, so technology, as also was mentioned now, technology has no value by itself if it's not used, and it can be commercialized through a business model. But if you have a novel business model and you have a sustainable technology, it still might be insufficient. One of the most highlighted cases in the literature is Better Place, which has really interesting business models. With leasing their battery, having a suspicion for it, and having a lot of venture capital also, but they still failed because they failed to track the whole ecosystem. So one player can't do it alone. And again, it's really tough studying business models and having people wanting to give you answer, what will the right business model be? Because that we only will know afterwards. So my research has been about trying to understand socio-technical systems and how we can make socio-technical change, how we can study this in actual local projects, and how we can understand business model in this context where we not see it as static. Because transition is a lot about understanding how have historical transition emerged, and how can then government, it's very much a policy tool, so how can government fix this market problem? And then business model is more from a firm perspective, how can we earn money on this? So I'm trying to combine this, what's the relationship between business models and socio-technical change in the early phases of potential transition before the transition actually has taken off. So I've developed a theoretical framework where I use 3 perspectives. First, the temporal one. Business model usually tend to focus on templates, on examples like the business model canvas. Most of you have probably seen it. So business model canvas, for me, is more of a very good way of describing a firm or business logic. But it's a static concept in one. It's a snapshot. So studying ERS from the beginning, when we don't even have the system out there, it's quite difficult to use it as a static snapshot. Second, usually these kind of studies tend to focus on a product or a service, on the autonomous innovation. So if you take a hybrid vehicle, it's not really comparable to an electric road system because we have different type of subsystems here. New types of interfaces, new type of actors. So taking into account the systemic part of innovation. And then from an actor perspective, going beyond only looking at the firm wanting to sell a product or a service to a user, but rather a closed system where we have one type of user compared to this might be then a highway scenario where you have different types of vehicle and users. And this will create different types of requirement on standardization and between the interfaces, and it also create different necessity for political involvement. And the second paper is then together with Mats. This is the one based on the study mostly on Scania and Volvo. So why do firms fail to manage the technology shifts? And we have a lot of examples. For example, Facit, you have Kodak, you have Nokia, all these kind of great companies that they saw the technology coming ahead, but they failed to change. They didn't survive. So one way of explaining it is that they failed because they were stuck in their own business model. And if you take the Scania and Volvo here, they have been central or based on the diesel engine. And then you can say that the value proposition, value creation, and value capture has really been at the center of this technology. So it's been their core competence in terms of what do we propose to the user in terms of brand, in terms of efficiency, how do we create this value, often intern when it comes to this core competence with diesel engines, and also the after sales, and how do we earn money on this. And this is still something that they're very good at. So then we started to explore two different strategies. We saw that, okay, these firms, they still have an option to actually act. Disruptive innovation theory is a lot about firms being unable to act, to change. So we saw that there is two interesting strategies here. The first one, as you see in the top, is the strategy of technology innovation. So if you do this, you as a firm or a company or an engineer say that we should know what's inside of the vehicle, we should control the technologies that are inside of the truck. So then you still have a very strong value creation. You know the technologies that are in this truck, and this is an example of that doesn't matter if it's above or underground or from the side or whatever technology it is, we should be able to provide it. However, if it's an electric road system scenario, the value of the truck might change. So your added value might change, which could lead to a very ambiguous value proposition and an ambiguous value capture, because the user might perceive something else as the most valuable thing. And then you have the second strategy, which is also interesting, going into servitization. And here, it's a little bit the opposite. If you think about Rolls-Royce, they very much go about power by the hour. We sell transportation solutions or engine solutions, and here's the same. So it could be that in this scenario that the vehicle manufacturers say, we sell efficient, effective transportation solution, and we sell them as systems or these solutions. And if they go that strategy, which goes more from a market perspective, then they tend to neglect the effect of technology change. So then what value creation would be is kind of ambiguous. So I think what we ended up is that you have to have a mix of these kind of processes, both technical-wise and market-wise. So third then, this is paper about the empowerment dilemma of niche advocates. And then, so it was interesting to analyze how the context then affect business model. So we tend to think that there will be one business model, but business models are very much shaped about the context and the specific case conditions. So the paper analyzes the empowerment processes of similar ERS projects in LA and Sweden, in Gävle. And it found out that the same actor enacted two different empowerment strategies here. So the first one is fit and confirm, where you believe that, where you argue that this technology will be cost effective for the users. Okay? So we don't need to change the institutions, we don't need to start there. This will be driven by the market because it's interesting for the users, as has been the case in Gävle, as you heard, as Jan Nylander told us. And the second one is the stretch and transform way of doing it, where the users aren't really the one saying, hey, we want this. Because that's not been the case in LA, because they have different types of, if Gävle was represented by heavy industry and a lot of logistics going back and forth, in LA it's been more where you have truck operators that operate one truck or two trucks, and they have a total different business model where they need to go from maybe one day at the harbor, next day to another region. So this is not interested for him. So it's not being driven by that, rather it's driven by air pollution and by agencies. So this has been more of a start where we need to change the institution, we need to change the infrastructure to make business model possible for users. So another matrix showing this. So the fourth and last paper is then exploring the window opportunity dynamics of infrastructure transformation. And I think many of us, Marcus said that we who work with business model, we tend to neglect infrastructure. And the study I did in LA really showed that infrastructure can be an enabler. It can open up a window of opportunity for these kind of zero-emission technologies. So there was a big road here, or I think, so this road, the I-710, it goes from the port of Long Beach, LA and Long Beach, up to a rail yard about 20 miles, and a huge demand on this road. 40% of the American container import comes through these ports, and they had to rebuild it to increase capacity, because capacity was very bad, air pollution is very bad, safety issues very bad. So they thought we should just expand the roads. Okay, so instead of 4 roads, we put 8 roads. And then people started to protest. Okay, if you do this, and now the consciousness regarding air pollution started to emerge. If you're going to increase it by 4 roads more, like 8 roads, 4 on each, 8 roads, will that be good for us? And we already have among the worst air quality in the whole country. So it was a public outcry, and then they started to think, what technology can we, how can we solve this? Then we have to go to zero-emission technologies, and batteries weren't seen as feasible, and not either maglev, so the ERS came in as a solution. And then you have this whole process where ERS was first in the project as a solution, and then kicked out from the project. And this is because the agencies, they tended to be technology neutral at the end, because there were too high risks in the financial investments, in the ownership arrangement, and the market incentives. Because users said, we are not going to sign up to use this. And when the users said, we are not going to sign up to use it, the financiers and the investor backed away from it. So it became sort of toxic. Are we going to invest something that won't be used? That's not good. So they started to say, well, we will have other technologies to solve this. We'll have battery electric vehicles, or fuel cell, or natural gas. So there are a lot of other types of politics, you can say. And another table to show this in the article. So I have my four papers. So how should we make sense of this? Then I bring my 3 perspectives here. That in paper 1, we studied the transition. We studied it from a system of systems, and you can see that this has implications for multiple stakeholders, not only a firm user here. And paper 2, with the Scania paper, was more about slide-in project. Here we have conceptual vehicles. It's more about testing radical innovation and incumbent business models, seeing how this disrupts the business model, what's not working with, why does this challenge it. And it's both the pilot project and the demonstration project are very temporary in time, 1 to 2 years. And they are, in the demonstration project, you have it's an experimentation of this system where you have more of a dilemma for them, how do we make this deployable, as you heard. And this last type of project is the deployment project, where it's more of a deployment of the infrastructure. So we have maybe a 30, 40 year of type of investment, and you change the whole type of system. So now this is actual change, which creates a chicken and egg dilemma for policymakers. So the findings then. So is this a potential transition where we go to niche and mass markets? So the findings show that if I analyze this from different actors in the pilot project, for example, the slide-in project, as you saw the truck, you can see there is, they test an alternative technology, and there is no discussion about new business models. So we saw that there are incumbent business models that won't work, but there is also only a link between the policymakers and the subsistence suppliers. We give you money for doing this kind of sustainable technology, and we develop this, maybe, hopefully, to create a market. In demonstration project, as in Gävle and LA, then, and now Germany, then you bring in the system users. So you test the whole system and also the perception of the users. And now business models are starting to develop here. But there is still no commitment between policymakers and users. Users are not committing that they should use it. And in the last project, then, deployment project, here to have this happen, you need to have the interaction then between policymakers, different types of subsistence suppliers, and system users. And I think this was then what was missing in the LA case. A clear commitment from users to policymakers and vice versa. So the findings show that business models aren't really there yet, and they are, you can perceive them in different types of way. So what theoretical implications does have is that we can see business models not as static and solution-driven, but rather as a perspective to study technology change. We can bring in not only technology, but also economic value for different types of actors, and also social value. So it's been really good as an evolutionary concept. And then trying to think about business model as reverse salient, as we saw on this deployment project. A reverse salient is something that holds back the development of the system. So and we tend to focus a lot in literature on the technology components of a system, for example, the battery holding it back, but we tend not to focus very much on and conceptualizing business models as reverse salient. And if we put that in the front, we can see how actors interact together and what the barriers and hinders are for enabling change. And furthermore, the studying business model is not only about studying a product or a service, it's about also understanding the basis of socio-technical change. So for Rolls-Royce and studying these kind of service-oriented business models, they don't take into account that we change the whole airport and the flights and the management of the users. But here really it is a socio-technical change where also regulation, the social aspect are very important. And lastly, I would 100% agree with Marcus here that we have to bring in the role of infrastructure here, both as a barrier, but more importantly, as an enabler. So can we find different types of infrastructure projects that open up and for zero-emission technologies, such as ERS? And how do road authorities then also bring in this into the national transport plans that are quite business as usual driven, because you can't risk too much in these kind of investments. So will ERS fly or not? To be or not to be? So if we just see this is a hype and disappointment curve, so you can see ERS hasn't been developed in a vacuum. ERS has, there are other technologies. ERS is not the solution, but it's rather one amongst different ones that has been discussed. So the question is, if we move 10 years ahead, will ERS be here in scenario 1, no discussion about it at all, or scenario 2, that the hype will increase? So where will we be? So why ERS will not take off? The first one, if you take it from a technical perspective then. Here, in this scenario, the diesel engine has continued to improve. So improvements that we didn't see today, we see them in 10 years, that it actually has occurred. And there's a sailing ship effect. When the existing incumbent technologies are threatened, they are actually gaining a last step. So we don't know really where we are on that curve. But we see that from a technical perspective, it was difficult to choose electric road system because it required new infrastructure on the public roads. It was easier to maintain status quo and maintain the interfaces and rather say this should be dealt by the market. So a gasoline station should be changed for a charging station or fuel hydrogen station. And this was actually what we saw, what we discovered in the LA case. Next one is then from the economic perspective, that if the high uncertainties deterred users to actually make commitments here in using ERS. And I think this is most importantly, we usually tend to start with this kind of picture about Paris, about climate change and energy security, air pollution, all these kind of challenges. But I think this is, what's the cost of failing? And I think in this scenario, the cost of failing was not too high. And then on the examples here, you see the first case is then Better Place, as I already mentioned. And maybe Jan Yolander knows this, the Dragon Gate. If you go, if you go by Gävle, you see this very nice hotel built by Chinese money, and they never ever come to the end that they opened because they weren't compliant with the policy agencies' demands. So will ERS be built on pilot tracks and then not be used by users in 10 years of time? Well, scenario 2 argues the opposite, that ERS will be a new dominant technology, but as a complement to other types of technologies, such as fuel cell and batteries, that could use like a range extender. And if you look from an economic perspective, it turned out that ERS actually is one of the most competitive solutions here, most competitive investments to make. And it brings a competitive advantage to users, as was said before, because there's an incentive here that you can save costs in the fuels. And then from political perspective, because it was so urgent, they had to use all different types of the solutions that were there. And these kind of conferences and these kind of collaborations made the interfaces open between the subsystem. And Sweden was positioned as a front runner. So we should continue doing this kind of research, in my opinion, study more the interaction between the policymakers and the users, going more into the specifics of the different cases that are emerging, now the pilot studies, for example, and understanding the users more than has been the case before, because we haven't had that data. So now it's becoming quite interesting, and also maybe trying to see how can this interact with different technologies. And lastly, I tend to sometimes brag about, oh, I feel that I've coined this concept of electric road system, and I feel very happy when it's been used, etc. And then Mats, my supervisor, told me, yeah, Stefan, you always think you're the first. Yeah. And then lastly, if somebody wants, ta-da! There's a copy here. If you didn't get anything what I said, you're free to take one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think this type of research is really important, and also to be aware of the disruptive scenarios which inevitably will occur.